All right. So you're an author of supernatural fiction. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a lot of genres and subgenres, but I would say urban fantasy romance specifically.
Oh, okay. So what got you into writing novels, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so I've always loved storytelling. Ever since I was a kid. I think I played make believe until I was like 16 years old. I had a best friend down the street that I've been friends with forever, and we were always making up stories together. And as I got older, that evolved into role playing and Dungeons and Dragons and LARPs and stuff like that. And I've, you know, I'm almost 40 now and married and have a bunch of kids, and opportunities for those things, although I've kept up with them, have been fewer and farther between. So um, I it kind of happened that one of my role playing buddies and I started putting down a story, and I read it over and thought like, hey, this looks okay. And from there, it all kind of snowballed into putting together a reader experience that I could share with other people. That's how I think about it. It's like almost like running a game for a huge audience, because I love GMing and doing tabletops. But this way I could kind of put together this story I wanted to tell and share it with many, many more people. And that was really appealing.
Now, the book that you interviewed me for, is this like your
Yes.
first foray into publishing, or have you been previously
No,
before?
the book I interviewed you for is the first in a new series. So I have a
Okay.
4-book series out currently, and
Oh, okay.
that's published through Athon Books and Blackstone. And so they're available in print, ebook, and audio. And that those 4 are my first foray into fictional publishing, and
Okay.
they came out last year. They did a rapid release starting in May and put one a month out. Um, Except the audiobooks are a little slower. So the 4th audiobook is not out yet. But after I finished with that series, I just wanted to try something different, because part of the joy I get out of writing is building systems and worlds. I especially love putting together supernatural, the supernatural architecture. So I moved on and picked a whole new setting, and I'm starting there. And the idea is maybe a little bit of a longer series this time. I want to do kind of a monster of the week type thing, but with some overarching character development plot for my main character.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about that first book series. So you did. So I'm assuming, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me. But
Yeah.
it seems to me like you basically wrote. Did you write one long story and then just broke it into chunks into the 4 different books, or was it just you finished one book and just had the creative flow state still going, and then you just continue to begin writing the next book, and then the next book, and then the next one until all 4 were done?
A little bit of both. So I started the first one without a super clear plan. I am kind of, when authors talk about the 2 different types of writing, the 2 different ends of the writing spectrum, we talk about plotters, which are like people who want to outline everything and have all of their key points and their arcs figured out and mapped. And, I guess like J.R.R. Tolkien would be on the extreme end of that. He wrote novels as background before he wrote his novels. And then you have discovery writers, or people who fly by the seat of their pantsers on the other end, which is like more like Neil Gaiman, who I think the famous quote is that your second draft is where you convince the audience that you knew what you were doing all along. And I'm much farther towards the discovery writing side of things. So I start with a character concept. I start with characters who I'm interested in telling about, and also some elements of the world that I think are fun to share. Like I interviewed you for the most recent series because I'm diving much deeper into cryptids and spirits and local folklore, for the flavor and kind of the supernatural texture of this new book series. With the last one, I'm a huge history geek, and I dove really deep into my love of history. and did the whole like ancient supernatural society and bringing artifacts that I loved and all of that into the plot. And also I set it in the 90s because I grew up in the 90s and I wanted the 90s nostalgia. So kind of like mashing those things up together, it kind of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets X-Files. And that's what I did last time around. And then this time I've got a different feel for it.
Okay. So you mentioned like architecture. Is that kind of either consciously or unconsciously looking at like the archetypes that are constant through many different stories? So like there's the hero archetype, the adversary, and all of that. And is that a conscious effort to bring those in, or is it just something that just kind of unveils itself as you're writing?
It mostly unveils itself when I'm writing. Characters are my strong suit. All authors have strong points and weak points, and building characters is one of my really strong points. So I don't have to think about it to make it fit. It just happens. It's kind of like somebody who can play music by ear, I guess. Not to say that 100% of people are going to connect with my characters, but to me, once I get a basic amount of information about them, I know what they're going to do. And sometimes they even go off script, I'm like, oh, this, I'm writing a scene and it doesn't happen the way I thought it was going to happen. And then I have to adjust. I have to analyze, is this truer to the character and truer to the story? And then I have to adjust based on that. So I think if you were to sit down, and I did do this with my first series because I worked with a developmental editor who was helpful about categorizing those things. And you can point out like, yes, this first book is a hero's journey. Here's the instigating incident. Here's the point of no return. Here's the, and you can go through those. And I think, every story slots into those to a certain extent. And that's a wonderful thing about stories, because I think those are deeply human truths also. And it's part of how we connect with the story.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I don't really think about it so much ahead of time. Sometimes it plays in more when I'm editing. If something doesn't feel right, I'll go back and I'll make a list. I'll be like, okay, what is my theme here? And how does this scene relate? And what am I trying to tell the audience? And do I need to cut this or change this significantly? Because when you're reading your own work, especially if you've let it sit for a couple of days and then come back to it, you can sometimes feel like, yeah, this one, these 3 paragraphs aren't doing what I want them to do. So there's a lot of analyzing and a lot of trying to figure out like what you're trying to convey to the audience and how effectively you're doing it. So I think that answers your question in a roundabout way.
Okay. Yeah. That's just interesting because I've tried writing. Well, I did complete a manuscript, but trying to get it published has been hell. But then again, it's completely different because it's more it's more of a history type textbook like endeavor, and it was just my first attempt at trying to write.
Yeah.
And so so how did you find that process, the publishing process? Like once you got everything written?
So I think that getting published is more about your ability to market yourself and less about the actual work you did. And that's a little discouraging because marketing's my weak point. I don't know how it could be different. Like, honestly, like I'm going to complain about a couple things with the caveat that it seems like a lot of people are doing the best they can, and I don't know how you could change it. But being able to reach out to agents and have, get their attention and have them look over my work is extremely challenging, as I'm sure you've experienced, because I don't know if you did you try to go with an agent or reached out directly to publishers, or what was your...
I imagine the process is probably different for you, but
since you're doing nonfiction.
Yeah, so what I had to do is I had to write a proposal, and then I had to write an abstract of what it was I was trying to accomplish. And then depending on that, then they want you to send a chapter at a time. Like you have an abstract of the chapter, and then of course your ORCID IDs put there, and if they accept it, then you have to send it chapter by chapter. Then you have to send like any figures or anything like of that sort, and you have to send that separate. And I guess the assumption is then they kind of put it all together.
Okay, so is it kind of, it sounds like a system where they're only investing enough effort to get to the next level because they've probably got a full inbox, which I think, although the exact mechanics are different, I think fiction works similarly in that, you send a synopsis and then you send a summary, which is a slightly longer synopsis. And then sometimes they ask for a certain amount of your work. And then sometimes they ask for the full manuscript. So there's a bunch of the similar steps that you're going through. And I actually hired someone to write my blurb and synopsis because I could not distill my own work down in a meaningful and attractive way. Because writing a 2-page summary isn't the same skill as writing a 250-page novel. And although I like to think that my novel writing is enjoyable and fun, my summary writing was not interesting.
Yeah.
So I ended up hiring to do that, and I got much better results once I did.
Yeah, it is an acquired skill. For me, I learned how to do abstracts from doing papers for undergrad, and then of course, if I try to once I try to go on to the next level, if I try to publish like in articles and journals, you have to have an abstract. So I've worked on that actively to try to make sure that I get the pertinent information and try to relay the main points of what it is I'm trying to relay.
Yeah, it's definitely its own beast. And I think that was emotionally the hardest part for me, because you've put some, and I don't know if it's the same for you, but you've put so many hours in and so much energy in, and you've got this thing and you really want to share it, and you just hear no a lot or nothing. A lot of people don't even respond, and it's months and months and months, years for some people, before you can connect with someone who's interested in opening the door for you. And I think that does lead to a lot more people self-publishing, which has its own pros and cons.
Yes.
But that was the hardest feeling for me. Like I think I'm pretty resilient about hard work, and I'm pretty resilient about being out there and having the public critiquing my work, but just being in that limbo state was really challenging.
Yeah, but it sounds like you've got some grit there to persevere and keep pushing on even with all the no's. Like, how long did it take?
So.
How long did it take, how long would you say it took before someone said, okay, yeah, we'll go with this? Was there a lot of being turned down, a lot of no's?
Yeah.
Was it a lot of silence?
It was about 7 months, which isn't a huge amount of time for finding. I ended up working directly with a publisher instead of going through an agent. I was submitting to both. And it was about 7 months before I got a yes. And I did get about I can't remember the exact number, but I want to say 10% full manuscript request from agents. So 10% of the people that I contacted asked for the full thing. And of that 10%, I had only heard back from a couple of them saying no. So it was still out there with several agents. I want to say 10 to 12 agents were still reviewing it when I decided to sign with the publisher. And having that, even though it didn't end up amounting to anything, knowing that people were looking at it and people were interested actually really helped keep me going, because it was that positive reinforcement that I needed to just keep trying.
Now, the first 4 novels where you mentioned being a game master, dungeon master with tabletop role playing, which I play D&D in
Oh yeah.
early 2000s. So
Who doesn't these days?
It's gotten very, very popular.
It
I
has.
remember when it used to just be small groups of people.
I know, it was like I did this back before it was cool.
Yeah, I totally understand that. So your first 4 novels, were they based on like the D&D worlds that you were creating as a game master, or was this stepping completely outside of that?
It was stepping outside. So what happened is it was actually a Rifts campaign. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
I've
Palladium.
heard the game. I've never played it. I had a buddy when I lived in Nevada. He ran and played Rifts heavily, whereas I stuck mostly to And I still stick mostly at 3.5 D&D. I'm not a big fan of 5th edition just because everything's so dumbed down.
It's
And
kind of gamified. Like I remember a 2nd edition was hard. Like,
yeah,
you had to calculate your THAC0 and things really killed you. It was not easy to survive combat, but in 5th edition, you can pull out, stuff. I don't know. I don't run a 5th edition game. I do play a 5th edition game. And it seems like you'd have to be having a really bad day or you'd have to be trying to die. And I don't know that like fatality was something that drew me to D&D initially because it felt like there was stuff on the line. So I have mixed feelings about it because I'm also attached to my character. So I have
character customization was a big thing for me. So like if I was going to like the skill sets, you could pick out all these different skills instead of it being lumped under the what would you say, the stats.
Yeah. Although I don't know, I think you can get too granular with that, and we're getting pretty deep in the geek weeds here. But I played gosh, I can't remember the name of it now, but it was like a far future sci-fi game, and my husband had to create a simple computer program to calculate bonuses because like the stat and bonus sheet was like 4 tiny printed pages. Like, it was like tiny print, big pages. I'm like, I don't even know how to, like, did I succeed? I have no idea. but yeah, so there was a character in this Rips game that played really well off of another one of the player characters there. Mm-hmm. And we started, I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 gaming types, the hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds, where you get different things out of the game depending on what kind of player you are.
Some people go for the role play experience. Some people like to just hack and slash. Some people like a good mix of the two. And
some people want to explore the world and just see all the cool things. And some people want to win all the treasure and, amass power and stuff like that. So those are the 4 basic archetypes. I'm a hardcore heart. I want the character interaction. I want the betrayal. I want the intrigue and espionage and all that. So consequently, I usually connect with the other heart players, and with the GM's blessing, we do little conversations on the side. So we were doing some of these side conversations, and I thought, hey, these 2 characters really mesh well. We should write some of this down. So we started working on it, and pretty soon it became apparent that we had like the start of a novel, maybe. And initially we thought we were going to work together on it, and then his life got complicated and it ended up being just me. But we took the 2 characters and plopped them in a different setting and just kind of started doing a hero's journey type story. So so that's how it was born, I guess, and that's how the gaming kind of rolled into writing. And I think that happens like The Expanse was a similar story. I believe it was 2 guys who were gaming together, and they had a bunch of characters they loved, and they thought, hey, we could really tell stories about this. So I think that it happens sometimes. It just gels. So my character, from that game ended up he's not a point of view character. He's one of the supporting characters, but I just loved his personality so much. I thought, this will be fun to write. So that's how that got kicked off. And then it went in a drastically different direction that I wasn't expecting, but enjoyed very much.
I mean, it certainly sounds like it went really successful in so far as that you were able to write out these novels and you were able to get them published. And now, did you do any like book signings or get to do anything like that?
Yeah, I've done a couple, and they're really fun. I love talking to people in person, and it was a shockingly cool experience to meet someone who wanted to meet me, who like knew me from my books and who wanted to take a picture with me and shake my hand. Like that is just, I can't describe that feeling, like that what I did made enough of a difference to this person that they showed up and they wanted a picture with me. And that was really cool. So I've done one locally. There's a bunch of cryptids in my first book too, because urban legends manifesting and coming to life was one of the villain powers that I gave my bad guy in the first one. And there's a brewery near me called Bunny Man Brewery, and Bunny Man is my big evil cryptid who has a huge fight scene at the end. I love writing fight scenes. And so I did a signing at Bunny Man Brewery, and that was really fun. And then I did one out in Vegas. And that was part of a book conference and like big author signing that I was doing. And then I'm debating going to the Mothman Festival this summer, because that sounds like it would be really fun and up my alley. So might meet more people there.
Yeah, one of my best friends actually went to the Mothman Festival one year and said he had a blast.
It looks really cool, and it's I'm driving distance, so there's almost no excuse. So
Okay, so going to the new series that's kind of 90s nostalgia, supernatural fantasy. So I guess the first question is the paranormal investigator character. What kind of inspired that whole X-Files ghost hunter kind of character? What kind of went into that as you were conceptualizing that?
Yeah, so I there's a couple of different so the first series is set in the 90s. Second series is going to be set in modern times. So the first series is called Words of Power. My second series is Eerie Amosville, just to give you names to differentiate them. But I get inspired by people that I talk to and people that I meet. So actually, you inspired the paranormal investigator, because I started asking for people.
That's interesting, because I haven't actively investigated since 2012, so I've been out of the loop for quite a bit, and I've never really advertised that I had done that after I kind of left the field. It was kind of like pursuing other things, and it was just so interesting that I had the message, hey, you used to ghost hunt and I'd like to talk to you about that. So how did you, I guess the question is, how did you happen upon me and my history as an investigator?
Yeah, so as part of my research for my first book series, because I was looking into cryptids, I joined a bunch of cryptid groups online. And then when I realized with my second series, I was going to go much more heavily into cryptids. I'm not doing any kind of traditional magic in the second series. It's all based around cryptids and biology and evolution, and things that we can't explain that mechanically work like magic. But I've tried to put them in the scientific kind of like evolutionary realm instead of like the supernatural realm so much. So that's a fun take. And I started asking about people who had had firsthand experiences, because my main character is a true believer, and I've never had a firsthand experience. I am a skeptic who's ready to be wrong, but I have never had a firsthand experience that I could attribute to anything supernatural or that couldn't be explained away by science. So I was like, okay, well, if I need a believable voice for my character, I'm going to have to connect with people who believe. And so I hopped on one of the groups and started interviewing people who have had experiences, either in the woods or sought things out or whatever, because I wanted to take those voices and infuse my main character with them. And your name came up. And when I messaged you, it's funny because the cryptid community doesn't love to talk about about their experiences a lot. I did get a few people who are very helpful, but people are pretty private about it, even though they're in a public forum. It's an interesting dynamic in those groups. So, you basically responded to my message, and I actually wasn't planning on doing any ghosts or anything like that, but I'm definitely incorporating them in book 2 at this point. Book 1, by the time I spoke to you, it was pretty much written, and I'm just infusing, I'm going back and writing the drafts and, infusing voices in draft 2. But in draft 2. But in book 2, like I said, I want to do different monsters in each book. I want to do something with a haunting. And I have a little bit of urban exploration experience that I did as research for book 1. And I want to combine those two things because urbex is fun and pretty big out here too. So I think it would be nice to put those two things together.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting that my name came up in the cryptid community, because I never went.
I never went.
No, actually, I don't. I don't. The only person that I know that has, I have a friend that lives in Iowa. She's from Texas, and she's more into ghosts and paranormal and psychic type things, and she been around the cryptid community, but I never went really looking for cryptids. I've mostly stuck to haunted places and things of that nature. So it was kind of strange for me.
Yeah,
It's
to get a
surreal.
message out of the blue.
It's just kind of surreal that, well, it's interesting because I had a friend message me not too long ago that he was talking to somebody, because I happened to have been on, an episode of Ghost Adventures a long time ago, and they're like, someone thought my friend was full of it, and he's like, well, here's the IMDb page, and he's like, hey, you have this, right? I was like, what? I have an IMDb. It's like, okay, that's interesting, and
It's a neat
that's
thing
how
to
I look.
discover about yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just, like I said, it's just kind of, it's kind of interesting how things kind of tend to circle, I guess,
Yeah.
that way.
Have you ever thought about getting back into it?
I have. I just don't know how I would. I have thought about it, but at the same token, it's like, how am I going to do it considering what I do now, and trying to not. It was easier as just doing paranormal whenever I'd ask somebody about, well, does anybody have a history of mental illness or some sort disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar, the psychotic disorders where people tend to have hallucinations, whether it be audio or visual,
Mhm.
because that's one thing that you would have to take into account. And now it's like, going into training to be a clinician, it's kind of like, I don't want to. I think the dynamic would be different. It would be
Yeah.
extremely different, and I don't know how to navigate that.
Yeah, that sounds a little sticky. Yeah, I can't offer advice, but it sounds like it would make it more challenging for sure.
But I wouldn't mind, like, going into places where it's like, hey, you already know the places on like Waverly Hills, or maybe even with the battlefields here in Virginia, or the old penitentiary, like in West Virginia, there's the old Moundsville Penitentiary, places that are there that you don't have to do like a private residence. I probably would say would be much easier, but I would probably definitely not do private residences or anything like that. And that's a twofold thing. One, it's what's the ethics there as a clinician when you're trying to ask about mental illness in the family and stuff like that, when you're trying to parse out, somebody's symptoms versus like what might actually be happening. So that's one problem. And the second part too is, when I lived out in Nevada, everybody, the Ghost Adventures thing blew up. So everybody knew who I was, whether I knew who they were or not. And that led to a couple of uncomfortable situations for me. And that's one of the reasons why I got out of it, is like, I'm not here to be some, show pony. It's, I'm here to genuinely try to help people if I can, but this just, it's not a good situation.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear that.
I think it happens to a lot of people when they end up, relatively, when I say relatively, I mean, it's not like I'm a famous celebrity or something like that, but when people know who
but
you are.
Locally, I've struggled with thinking about that too. I use a pen name, because I want to keep it separate from the other things that I do in life. But I've always struggled with how much of my identity to keep private and how much is okay to put online. And, that's a question everybody has to answer. And then when you start to put yourself out there to more people for whatever reason, it complicates things. You have to think about it more. And
Absolutely.
yeah, especially when, you've got another job and a family and, all of these other items that you might not want crossing over into that part of your life. And it might be impossible to keep them totally apart. So, I think that's just something you have to figure out what your tolerance is as you go along and do your best to manage it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think helps too is that I try to be very careful with my words. Especially, I don't know how much of the podcast you've listened to before you agreed to come on, which thank you for agreeing to
yeah, absolutely. I don't know how I listened to some of your Gulag Archipelago, and I was like, I hope I'm not following. That's pretty deep and heavy. And
Well, I'm a big fan of history
yeah.
for one, and two, it's one of the books I really recommend to people, like especially where I work at the state hospital.
Mhm.
It's not an ideal place that anybody really wants to spend time in. For most people, on average, their stay is about half of a decade, anywhere between 5 to 6.5 years.
Mhm.
And you can see where someone might become very bitter and resentful about that very quickly.
Yeah.
And so the idea was, well, we would read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and then we'd read the Gulag Archipelago. So you get two ideas of where two tangible examples of like hell on earth, let's say.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so what's the lesson here? Well, with Frankl, it was you find meaning and responsibility, and meaning will help you get through all of the tragedy that comes with the situation you're in. You may not have any control over the circumstances you find yourself in, but you do have control in how you react to them and your choices moving forward.
Mhm.
And then Solzhenitsyn looked at everything that happened in his life and decided to take responsibility for everything that he did that may have put him there. And then, okay, going forward, how do we navigate this, and how do we warn other people that if you continue to go along with the lie of the state, that this could very well be your fate too, kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so the injunction there was, is for the patients there, that maybe you should look into your own lives at all the things that you've done that may have led you to this point. And then if you can take responsibility for that, how can you prevent it from happening again in the future? Because there's some guys that are just in and out all the time, and they spend half their life or more inside an institution rather than out in the world living their lives to the degree that they could live the best life possible for them.
Yeah, that is a rough but necessary message, it sounds like. And yeah, it's I remember I have read bits of the Gulag Archipelago. I love history, but I'm very sensitive, and I find that I have to shelter shelter my emotions from some of the really rough stuff. I'm aware of it. I know it. Like I factually accept it, and I know enough to teach my kids, but I can't delve too deeply into the details, or I start getting really down really fast. But I think that those works are enormously important, and I'm so glad that they're out there and accessible, and that we can continue to learn from them. That's an amazing gift. So
Absolutely.
yeah. And
So,
thinking about, it's interesting to me to think about, as an author of fiction, and admittedly a silly escapist genre. Urban fantasy generally isn't going to change anybody's life, but what I have thought a lot about what your responsibilities are, even as a novelist. As far as what are you representing as solutions? What are your heroic qualities? Like how is it okay for your heroes to behave like they can be flawed? Yes, how flawed? Asking those kinds of questions and thinking about the people who are going to read your words and how it's going to impact the way that they think about things. Even in a small way, I think is an interesting thing to ponder and consider.
oh yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite fiction authors is Dostoevsky, and he related a lot of psychological and deep truths, even to his characters, even though they were absolutely fictitious.
Mhm.
Um, I would say the Brothers Karamazov is a great example of that.
I haven't read it, but
It's about 700 and some pages. It's a pretty invested read.
mhm.
But one of one of the things that he was trying to solve was the tension between religious and atheist thinking, because he was
Mhm.
around like 60, I think 60 years before the Russian Revolution, and he was thinking, so he did this subset story that I want to say it was Dmitri was telling the story, or maybe it was one of the other characters, but it was the Grand Inquisitors, what it was about.
Mhm.
And basically just makes the idea of, it's like Christ comes back, performs some miracles, and the church arrests him, and the head of the church says, how dare you come back? We have everything sorted out. We're doing just fine, and now here you are. What are we going
Oh
to do
man,
about
kind
that?
of like the first time.
Yeah. And so what Christ does is kisses the man on the lips, as a sign of love. And the Grand Inquisitor is so shocked by that, he just kind of leaves, but leaves the door open. And of course, Christ leaves. And so it gives one to think about, like, exactly what is the church in relation to what is religious, and what is the truth and what is religious, kind of thing.
Yeah, that is a puzzle that I am personally still trying to tease out. And I think if you're not thinking about it, it's not a good thing. Like, I think that it's natural. I mean, when you talk, we're I don't know if you mind, we're delving into religion now.
It's
okay.
something that's deeply fascinated me for the last 3.5 to 4 years.
Okay, well, good. I'm a cradle Catholic, and my mom was a convert, my dad's non-practicing, and so it's something that I thought about a lot too, with that background. My entire family is very analytical, and we like to question and talk about and try to pick apart and have arguments about. And so that's kind of the culture in which I was raised. And I think it's healthy, because I think as a child, as a very young child, you just accept what you're told for the most part. And then as you get older, it's appropriate and developmentally correct to question those things. And you have to come to the realization yourself of their validity or not. And my mom has a saying. She says, God doesn't have any grandchildren. That if you are going to be a person who follows a religion in your adult life, you're going to have to come to it of your own intellect and decision. It's not something you can inherit. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There should be a lot of truth to that too, because if you haven't thought about it enough to embrace it or reject it for yourself, then you probably haven't thought about it enough. So it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. It is. Because one of the things I've noticed is that one of the things that I've noticed is especially with like the really radical atheist types, is they've fallen so far in love with rationality that it's almost a mirror of what Milton described Lucifer as with the fall. The idea of rationality can fall in love with itself into a sort of totalitarian presumption of what I know is sufficient in all totality, and anything else, like even the transcendent, is not needed. And that kind of leads to its own pitfalls, that whole pride before fall kind of thing, which I think is true. And it's not just, it's metaphorically true, but it's psychologically true. And I think we can see how it plays itself out in the world to a degree, because we all meet people that are so sure of their own rationality, but they end up making really bad decisions or acting terribly in the world, and the consequences.
Well, I mean, I think it follows a logical path too, because if there is no God, then man is the most intellectually advanced, perfect being that on the, in the universe that we know of. So I think there's a certain logical flow there. It's not, I know people who are atheists and who are secular humanists who are lovely, kind, giving people. And it's been an interesting experience for me to have closer friendships with people who are on a very different place of the spiritual spectrum than I am, because I guess it's not how I would have pictured that state of being, but encouraging in a way, I suppose, that although I think it can lead to very deep folly and a loss as well, that some people can also continue to function in a compassionate and empathetic way, and almost thrive in that space. So that's something I'm still picking apart. It's something I haven't totally reconciled with my observations, and what I would think hypothetically it would look like are very different. And so I have to continue to analyze that.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. So when you talk about responsibilities as an author and putting words out there, so What do you think are some responsibilities of being an author?
Um, I think that there are social responsibilities. Um, I like flawed characters. I'm going to start with the caveat that I love flawed characters. I love anti-heroes. I love redemption stories. I even like characters, like I'm very drawn to characters like the Joker in Batman, who's just
Mhm.
a force of nature and there's nothing redeemable about him. He's a bad guy. Like he might occasionally do good things as kind of a course of strategy, but he's not, he's not a good guy. Um, I enjoy reading about characters like that, but I think you have to be honest about who and what they are. And I don't write young adult intentionally because I wanted the freedom to have more morally gray characters and not feel like I was forming a young mind in a particular way to both enjoy a character and like a character, but then also see their questionable actions and wonder if those were all right. um, so there are, it's interesting. There are some things that they say are like unforgivable sins, like if your heroes do these things, then your audience will never forgive them. And I haven't seen that actually to be the case. Like killing an animal, uh, spousal abuse, child abuse, really, bad things that don't read sympathetically on the page. I don't think readers actually won't forgive. I think if they like the character, they'll forgive them for almost anything. But thematically, I feel like although characters can be gray and make poor decisions, you have to show the consequences of those poor decisions and the effects of them on other people. And you need to not save your characters from the consequences of their actions. So if one of your, protagonists, I'm not going to use the word hero, but if one of your protagonists, does something that would, I'm trying to think of an example, but if they don't notify someone of a potential like hazard or something, like let's say that there's a situation where there's an unstable magical field, and if they don't tell the authorities, people are going to get hurt, and if they do tell the authorities, it's going to reveal that they're in the know and they'll be personally in danger. So if they choose themselves over other people, there's got to be fallout from that, and there's got to be repercussions, and they have to go through the appropriate mental states and suffer loss, and it can't just be something that gets wiped away 3 chapters later. So I've tried to build more complex moral questions because I think those are interesting, and in several places in my book I give my characters choices where there is no good choice, where whatever they do, it's going to end with some level of loss and trauma. And then I don't save them from it because I want people to see, that sometimes when you're in a really tough decision-making scenario, there isn't a good decision. And I thought back to, articles that I read about, like, people in World War II who were, who had cracked the Nazi code and they knew a city was going to be bombed. But if they evacuated the city, everyone would knew they had cracked the code. And, they didn't evacuate the city, but the devastation was intense. And, that's something they're going to carry for the rest of their lives. And I think too often in fiction, we make things easy for the hero, and we don't show that in a realistic situation, there are sometimes no lossless answer. And I like exploring that theme. So that's something that I tried to do in my writing and hopefully did successfully. I've heard some good things from people who have read it, but it doesn't make for quite the happily ever after read that a lot of people want out of a series. So it's a little more complex.
Well, I mean, life is extremely complicated and complex, and so to try to mirror what it's like realistically, whether you have decisions where there's no real good outcome,
Mhm.
and then showing the fallout of that, because that realism, that's something that a reader can try to put themselves hopefully would put themselves into thinking that. Now, a lot of people don't do that.
A lot of people don't want to either. Like some people just strictly read for escapism. They just want to, like I've read quite a bit of the romance genre because I like to write character relationships. And the vast majority of the romance genre is just consequence-free environment, completely unrealistic, people coming together and getting married at the end. And like, there's nothing wrong with that, I guess, as long as you realize that it's total cotton candy. It's mental cotton candy, and
Yeah.
there's no substance to it. It in no way reflects real life, and this is just like something silly that you're enjoying because it's an entertainment.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just a totally different thing. So yeah.
No, I was going to say, well, I think that that's an individual thing too. Like, for example, like if I read something fiction, like I just finished well, that's probably a terrible example. Well, I just finished reading Aesop's Fables because I'm planning to do a YouTube lecture series on what the stories mean, how they relate to other stories, and I'm looking at it from metaphorical, psychological, religious, and I take inspiration from Jordan Peterson's biblical series lectures of like, okay, well, if he did that for this, it would be interesting to see what we could do with Aesop's Fables because they're older, but there's similarities in some of the stories. And if I get good feedback on YouTube, I'm thinking about doing like a public lecture to see what happens. It's just an experiment. Neat, yeah. But House of God by Samuel Shem, it's a fiction. It's based on it's an exaggerated account of what it was like for I can't remember what Samuel Shem's the author's pen name, but he's a psychiatrist and talked about what it was like in the 70s as a medical intern. And there's exaggerations of what goes on in a hospital, but it was a fun, mindless read. But when I read something like history, especially if I'm trying to understand what happened, because for some odd reason I got interested in atrocity and what it is that drives people to commit those types of things. When I read Ordinary Men, which is about, it's about a police battalion that was sent into Poland. They were middle-aged. They were World War I veterans. They were policemen. They didn't grow up in Hitler's ideology. They had already matured by that point. And they started off as, okay, well, we're going to have to go here into Poland. We're probably going to have to do some things that we don't really normally do because we're in a war. And by all accounts, their commandant was a decent guy. And he even said, if you don't want to participate, you can leave. And only one person out of that whole battalion left. And they started off, rounding up, the young Jewish men and doing away with them as they were wont to do in a war. And then it escalated to taking women and children out in the woods and shooting them in the back of the head. And a lot of them became violently ill. All of them became alcoholic, and they took it one small step at a time. And it wasn't like a Milgram experiment at all. They voluntarily took those steps into this transformation that they underwent.
Yeah.
And I try to read that from what would you say? Wasn't reading it as if I would be someone who would be able to try to save anyone. I wasn't trying to read it as just a observer of history, but really try to get into what would it be like if I were the Auschwitz guard kind of mindset.
Yeah.
That was not a fun experience by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I've done something similar. I can't remember if it was Gulag Archipelago or another book, but they talk about how, we would have been better fighting them at the doorway and fighting them on the stairs. And, they go through like, how everyone silently watched it happen and hoping that, oh, they won't come for my family, they won't come for me until they finally do. And then everybody else silently watches it happen. And thinking about myself, I have quite a few young children and, could I be the person that stood up, knowing that it would be putting my family at risk? Could I be the person who tried to change the way things were going? I don't know that I can answer that with a firm yes. And I don't like thinking that about myself, but I also have to be honest.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard thing.
Yeah, because what I was trying to figure out was Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, and he's and a psychologist, and very brilliant. And he talked about the shadow. That's the dark side of humanity. That's the parts of ourselves we try to hide from ourselves and hide from other people. Hence why it's the shadow. It's there, but you don't acknowledge it. And Jung said most people don't integrate that because the experience is too terrifying. Because you have to actually be honest about those parts of yourself that you really don't want to be honest about. So when I read that, I thought, could I be someone that could do that? And I had to really be honest and be like, okay, what situations would have to take place, be like the perfect storm of situations where I could do something like that. And I could see myself actually doing it. And that's when I was like, okay, now I get it. Now I get it. I get it. There's got to be a way to act so that if the opportunity presents itself, I wouldn't take it, because the likelihood that I would is very high.
Yeah, and I think that in a lot of ways we live in a really sheltered culture, a really sheltered life experience, where we're not confronted with death very regularly. And when you read accounts of history, cities being razed, or people being executed, or whatever, human sacrifice, whatever you're reading about that seems so incredibly foreign, and like, how could this happen? How were these people who weren't different from me and you doing these things? I think that it's maybe a big part of it is just because you and I have never been asked to make that jump. I don't think you're a veteran, are you? You've never served in combat.
No,
a veteran friend of mine has talked about making that jump, and making the jump from not killing anyone to being expected to kill people and to seeing people die, and that it changes you fundamentally, and you can't go back to the way that you were before. He said that coming home was like, like you went and you made the jump and you're in this incredible group of people who are, accomplishing amazing things, and you're changing the world and you're making this enormous impact. And yes, you're facing very, very tough situations too, but you have this unit of camaraderie. And then you come back and it's like everybody's in kindergarten drawing with finger paints. And you remember being in kindergarten drawing with finger paints, but you can't go back to being in kindergarten drawing with finger paints, and nobody else can understand where you were.
Yeah,
because we haven't ever been there.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've had a couple of veteran patients that I've dealt with. And one of the things that's interesting about PTSD and veterans is a lot of it, yeah, they're under high stress situations, they're being shot at. There's the possibility of death every day from either explosives planted in the ground or whatever. But this one young man, when we were talking about it, and so what I said was like, I said, maybe you should read Ordinary Men and tell me what you think about it. And he realized that a lot of it was that he never conceptualized himself before he went over there, someone who was capable of taking lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of him was so foreign to him that it's almost like another person does it. And that was his first confrontation with the idea of good and evil. And so we talked about that. He had some horrible nightmares, but we would talk about them and figure out what was his dreams were trying to tell him. Because one of the things is he made a lot of friends with his unit, and a lot of them ultimately died in an IUD attack. The improvised explosive device, IED, yeah. And so he would have these nightmares of this desert spider just sucking him alive, like emaciating him in his dreams. He'd wake up. It was the same dream every night.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about it, and we talked about how spiders represent the shadow. And I was like, what is it exactly that you're not really wanting to confront, that you're running from? Because the spider is always on your back, so you're not acknowledging it. That's why it's behind you. And it was, a lot of it had to do with survivor's guilt, and a lot of it had to do with that. And so just talking about it and acknowledging that, and then, it's like, if you look at it reasonably, because I asked him, I said, you were the guy that was kind of charting everything out. I said, is there any reason whatsoever that you would be expected to know that these things were out there? Well, no. So okay. If we can agree that there's no reasonable expectation on that, then is it perhaps that maybe your guilt's this spider that's sucking you dry, and perhaps confronting that honestly might actually make it go away? And so after a couple of months of therapy like that, the nightmares went away.
Well, that's dream interpretation is something that I find fascinating and have no grasp of.
It's very rare. It's a very rare thing. It's not done a whole lot because psychoanalytic therapy is considered, well, for one, it's a long term. Two, it's considered too expensive, and three is it's all theoretical, and there's not a whole lot of empirical data that backs up that it exists, because insurance companies want evidence-based practices. That's why cognitive behavioral or dialectical behavioral therapy are like the two top gold standards, because the goals are set up in what's called SMART. So you have short-term, measurable, articulated properly, they're reasonable, and they're timely.
Yeah, it's I can see how, I mean, it's in it because we know very little about the brain, and in therapy and psychology are constantly using theoreticals to attempt to improve the lives of patients, because sometimes things work, you just don't know why they work. And I mean, I remember I did EMDR therapy for a while, and it was the same kind of thing. It's like, okay, I don't know if you're familiar with EMDR at all. It's used to treat PTSD, but it's a stream of consciousness type therapy where you hold sensors in each hand and they buzz alternately, and then your eyes track lights in a pattern on the screen while your therapist prompts you through different stream of consciousness type imagery or thought processes to help resolve past trauma. And it sounds like complete quackery. Like, honestly, like it sounds like you're doing what exactly?
It does sound like that. Now, it has been shown to work for PTSD, but yeah. I think the underlying principle is the same as all psychotherapy, and it's that we can tie it to archetypically as well, but it's the idea that you have to face that which frightens you, that is what makes you stronger, not so much less afraid, because that's not what happens. You just become much braver and more courageous. You're still afraid.
Yeah.
And Jung thought of that as, I can't remember what it was in Latin, but it was like, it roughly translates to in filth it will be found, which means what you're looking for is where you least want to look. And you have to confront those traumatic memories, and you have to process them, so that way they don't cause the post-traumatic symptoms, or at least it lessens them to a great degree, because you are having to confront that, but you're doing it voluntarily. Yeah. And that's the same basis in any therapy. And it's the idea of the hero going and looking for the dragon in its lair and getting the gold. That's one of those things where it's metaphorically true, it's psychologically true, and it's metaphysically true, because we can see it, how it plays out in the therapeutic environment.
Except that, in the therapy sense, to take the metaphor a little farther, the dragon never actually goes away. You just kind of learn how to deal with it, I guess.
But you do get the gold, and the gold is, you do come out of it a bit, stronger in character, better.
Oh, absolutely worth doing. Not arguing that. I don't know. Therapy is a wonderful tool, but it doesn't fix you. It's developing strategies to be a happier, better adjusted person. But it's not going to change the core of who you are. So, or what you've been through.
No, not at all. So the next book, where you're talking about hauntings, well, we kind of went a little heavy there, so it's kind of nice, I guess.
Well, yeah, sure. Let's go back to fiction.
But the next book with haunting. So where are you kind of going with that? Is it like, urban legend, places extremely haunted kind of thing, or taking it
I'm
more from the
still,
real
yeah,
world of, like somebody has a haunted house and they're freaking out and call somebody to come check it out and things go off the rails for a bit there? And
I'm still trying to decide. I've got a couple different minds, and sometimes I don't fully decide until I start writing and I see if it works or not. And I haven't started writing book 2 yet, but my basic premise. So I've got my main character is a man in his late 20s who works for animal control out in rural Virginia, and he's a true believer in things that go bump in the night, and he gets kicked the weird cases, like unidentified animals and strange stuff going on. And I have it set up from a world building point of view, world building architecture, that it makes sense that there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this area. I'm not going to get into the weeds with that, but for various reasons, this area has an incredibly high concentration of stuff that can't be explained. So I'm thinking, when we talked, you talked about different kinds of haunts. You talked about like residual, and you talked about intelligent. And I'm thinking I'm going to need to talk to you more about intelligent haunts, because that's obviously the more plot interesting way to go. And I'd like to base it on some real, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on this? Like basing it on real local folklore and like real events. Do you think I'm always trying to be respectful. So do you think is that disrespectful? Because
no,
we're talking about events that actually happened to real people, and
because if you ground it in reality, it makes it more, I would say grounding it in reality makes it more, well, it's more true, because people read me like, oh, even if you were to change the name of the place and maybe change the history a little bit, it's like, there's something familiar about it that will pull someone in. So for example, I was always interested in, and this will kind of go and tie into, I guess, the book I try to get published and haven't had any success with, is the Dejarnet Sanitarium there off near I-81 and 64 in Staunton.
mm-hmm.
And that place is supposed to be incredibly haunted, and
Mm-hmm.
and for all kinds of reasons, mostly because early psychiatry, places like Western State Hospital, Eastern State Hospital, even Central State, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum up in West Virginia, what used to be the old Weston State Hospital. Originally, places like that were meant for custodial. It's like it was too harsh to put mentally ill people in prison, so they would put them in the asylums and let them kind of be there and manage behavior, so that way people were not getting hurt. It wasn't until the 1950s, early 1900s, to the 1950s, that we really started to see treatment rather than just containment.
Yeah. Well, I think a sanitarium would be an excellent setting. What a great backdrop, right?
But they're archetypical in a sense too. Because anytime you mention a mental hospital or an asylum, you automatically get drawn to like the big Gothic structures, the ideas of, primitive electroshock therapy treatment, which was absolutely brutal in the beginning. It's something that's still done, but it's in rare cases, but it's much safer and much more controlled. But you already have those images kind of come to mind. So it's archetypical in the sense that you've got this archetypal landscape that really sets it up for a lot of really good stories. When I DM D&D, you wake up and you're in this, describing an old hospital room in an old asylum, and it's
right.
So
the fear is already there too. Like, you don't have to start from scratch, because people already have these deeply ingrained fears of those kinds of places. So when you're playing with psychological horror elements, which I like to do, anytime you can draw on, I think you have to be effective, you have to draw on existing fears, because you want your reader sitting there tying it back to their life, whether they're doing it subconsciously or consciously. nothing is going to give you goosebumps if you can't think of it happening to you or imagine it happening to you, or, you know, be in that moment. So I think it's great for that. So my main character is going to have developed a little bit of a reputation having solved things in book one. And then I think he's going to get roped into a haunting that he doesn't really know how to deal with. And one of the plots I'd like to do for this book is actually him learning the process of, like, you know, he'll probably go the first time and completely flub it, and then have to do research and talk to people and learn the process of, like, okay, what do we do for this? You know, how do we handle this? And, you know, a big part of the plot will be him getting his act together and developing the skills so that he can help successfully resolve it in some way. So that's pretty rough outline, but that's the way I'd like to go with it, because part of my enjoyment with this series is bringing the readers, you know, kind of like a getting their hands into whatever's happening. So I want them, you know, moving along with my main character and learning more about paranormal investigation or whatever it is in a boots on the ground sense, because that kind of stuff is fascinating. I like reading about it. I like reading a book where I come away saying, like, oh, I actually learned something here, you know. And yeah, so I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned learning the skills. I don't. What's funny, and this is kind of an anecdotal thing, is after we kind of got established, because we started, like, when I started in West Virginia at 16, you know, that's when I first started doing that. It was just me and a couple of friends. We didn't really try to do a team until about 2000. So that was 2 years before Ghost Hunters came out, because I think they came out, what, like 2001, 2002, roughly about that time. So I learned all the, like, how to organize a team and how it should be run from them. And then the Ghost Adventures guys came out, and a lot of the younger kids that were getting into it, they thought that going in and yelling at things and trying to, you know, taunt things to attack them was the right way of going about listening. And it ended badly for quite a few people. Some people would get scratched. I've seen that happen. That's unexplainable. Some people would have stuff follow them home. I've had shit follow me home. I have things that follow me home from work.
Wow. So, yeah, you're reminding me. I was at church a couple weeks ago, and we had an exorcist who was doing a talk, and they don't talk about their work. They don't talk about what they do. It just is a policy. You cannot get them to talk about it. But he was giving a sermon about something entirely different. And one of the things he said is he got on an airplane and he was looking for a seat. And, you know, the first seat he walked by, he really didn't want to sit there. The person, you know, in the seat already was snoring and, you know, making tons of noise. He didn't want to be on that flight. So he kept walking. And the next man he passed that had an empty seat next to him, he said there was something evil in him, and I knew I couldn't sit by it for the plane ride. And just like the passing comment of, you know, oh yeah, he just walked by and sensed something evil that he couldn't sit by for a plane ride, and he continued on his way. You know, that's a sense I can't imagine having.
I can't imagine that either, because I've never had that sense. Like, I know what it means to feel like you're being watched. I know what that's like. That's where you can objectively see there's nobody around, but you know when you're being looked at. It's kind of uncomfortable. Or as my wife says, you know, feeling skeeved out when you know there's nothing around you. You feel that way.
I'm so of two minds about this, because part of me wants to go kick the hornet's nest and be like, okay, you know, I'm a skeptic. I will show me. I want to see it.
Hey, that's how she was. She was totally not a believer. Waverly Hills is what made a believer out of her.
But I don't particularly want, like, part of me doesn't want to be a believer too, because I sleep pretty well at night right now.
It wasn't so much like she was kicking a hornet's nest. All she wanted to do was do a science experiment. So she formulated her hypothesis is that if the place is haunted, we should get EVPs if there's nobody on the floor that the recorder is with, or above or below. So we had to go completely away from the whole area, and she locked down 3 floors of Waverly Hills. She's got 2 recorders, one not so much at each end of a hallway, but about a quarter of the way in. So they're still far away from one another. Because if there's going to be sounds, they're either going to get it on one recorder or the other recorder, not at the same recorder.
Mhm.
Or the null hypothesis is you're just going to get an hour of silence. That's it. And she sat there with a flashlight and watched these two things and just never heard a thing happen, never had one personal experience on that floor. She let the recorders run for an hour and a half. So she went and took them and plugged them into the computer, pulled up Audacity, uploaded the audio and started listening to it. And then she started hearing like doors slamming. She's like, there's no doors on this floor. Why are the doors slamming? There's no doors on the random coughing, but there's nobody above or below or on that floor. It's just her. What sounds like dragging sounds, people talking, but there's no source that she can discern that made these sounds. And that's when she was like, okay, there's something to this because we've got audio here. We shouldn't have audio here, but we have audio here. And so that's when she's like, okay, there's something here that I don't quite understand that doesn't fit the scientific method. And that's the other thing that makes paranormal investigating hard as if you're going to try to make it an empirical science, is you have to be able to predict and you have to be able to get repeatable results to show a reliability and validity of the methods. Out in the wild, those things don't happen. That's why I turned away from social psychology, is because you can't predict for all the variables. And when you're doing experiments out in the wild, sometimes things.
Well, I mean, it sounds like repeatable experimentation is the, holy grail of any branch of science.
That's why the big five model of personality is the go-to for psychology, for personality psychology, for measuring traits. The Myers-Briggs, the one that's the big popular one that you see done online all the time. Yeah, there's a good reliability for the extroversion and introversion. What would you say for those two dimensions of the MBTI? But all the other ones, the reliability is below 0.4 to 0.6, and to be considered reliable is 0.7 and above. That's why when people bring up the Myers-Briggs, I'm like, that's such a terrible test.
Those things persist in the public consciousness, though. Like regardless of how incorrect or disproven or whatever, I don't know. Like I'm thinking back to when you're a kid and you get taught about how there's different kinds of taste buds on different parts of your tongue. Like it's totally demonstratively false, but it's taught in every kindergarten.
Yeah, it's just like I said, pop psych. It's like one of those things that happens to be true enough that if you wanted to use it, you could, if you're doing it for one to understand a basic understanding of what your personality is like. But if you want to go for the more hard science, predictable, then that's where the big five kind of fills in the gap there.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've done over an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Thank you again for coming on. I've totally enjoyed the
conversation. It was really fun chatting with you.
And if you have any more questions as far as for research for your book, I'm be more than happy to help out with that.
Yeah, I'm sure I will. Like I said, I'm in the weeds of editing right now, which always takes longer than I think it would. I do about 7 or 8 drafts before I send it over to beta readers, and then I do another one. So that takes some time. But once I'm done with this one, I'll start writing the next one pretty soon. So I'm sure I'll be in touch. Because if I go deep into ghost hunting, I need to pick your brain about specific experiences so I can add all those good details. So
okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, and you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. You as well. Take care.
Yes, you too.